In this video, we're going to be talking about promises. So you might already be familiar with the concept of promises. A lot of JavaScript frameworks have the concept of promises. Angular has its own promises. JavaScript has its own promises. There are standalone promise libraries like Q and Bluebird. And it's a very common pattern in JavaScript to deal with asynchronous workflows, and it's very, very powerful. It's so popular and so powerful, in fact, that it's been incorporated into the ES2015 standard. So the promises that we're going to be talking about are standard compliant promises that are actually part of ES2015. I do want to point out that this is going to be the first video in this section that I do not introduce any additional new syntax. I'm really just introducing a new API. Now, fortunately, that API is added in the core.js polyfill, which comes as a part of the Babel polyfill. So be sure, if that you want to use promises, like I'm going to show you in this video, that you do have the polyfill being included on your page. Anyway, promises are pretty straightforward, and you really start to see their value when you have more complex applications. We don't necessarily have time in this part of the series to put together a complex application, but I will try to sort of simulate one. So we'll start off by creating a couple JSON files in our public directory. Make sure that you create them in your public directory because you're going to need to make sure that you can request them from the browser. So the first JSON file I'm going to make is going to be Users.json. So it's just going to be a straight up JSON file. Really not that exciting. Pretty straightforward stuff. All right, so let's go ahead and copy and paste this a couple times so that we can get done with this file as soon as possible. So we have a bunch of users. Why not? They'll all be admins. Doesn't really matter for this example. So I'll come back to public, I'll right click and create another file, and I'll call it tracks.json. Let's say we're making a music website. And here, I'll just try to keep things simple. We'll say title is track 1. And we'll create a couple other tracks like track 2, track 3, and track 4. Sounds really exciting, doesn't it? Okay, so we have our tracks.json and our users.json. It really doesn't matter what's in these files as long as you have something that you can read from the public directory from. That'll be served by the HTTP server. So let's go ahead and make our HTML file. So I'm going to copy and paste this iterators fun file, and I'm going to rename it 09 promises. And then I'll change the script that we're loading to 09 promises. And of course, I'll have to come into my source scripts and create a corresponding 09 promises.js. I'll go ahead and open up my self-executing function, and I will split my windows, hop over to what we have being compiled here, and I think we are set. So the concept of promises is very straightforward. The idea is that you create an object, and the object can be, the object represents an asynchronous operation. And I know we've talked about what asynchronicity really means in some videos ago, but to kind of simplify it as quickly as possible, asynchronous just means that we tell the browser to go do something, like load a file, download a file, send a post request, whatever it needs to do. Maybe even just we tell the browser to wait for a period of time. Those are all asynchronous operations. They're asynchronous because we tell it to do something, and then we want it to tell us when it's done, or if an error happened. So a promise is a codification of that pattern. It's basically you can think of it as a asynchronous operation on steroids. So for the first bit of this example, I'll go ahead and show how we might load in users.json. In a non-promise way, in a sort of traditional, standard, boring, vanilla JavaScript way. So let's go ahead and create a function. It's going to be called load users CB. CB stands for callback. I want to be able to differentiate my promise functions with the callback functions. And he will take in a callback. And then he's going to use JavaScript's AJAX. Oh, we're finally using JavaScript. Or JavaScript, jQuery. He's going to ask for users.json. Yeah, apparently we didn't need jQuery for like most of that, but whatever. Didn't hurt. He'll have a data type of JSON. His success callback will simply take in data and invoke callback with null as the first argument and data as the second one. And then we'll have a error that gets an error parameter, and we'll invoke callback, error, and null. Okay, so basically pretty straightforward. I mean, one interesting thing to note here is we're using the new object literal syntax to pass this into jQuery. Other than that, very vanilla, very straightforward JavaScript code. So to use this, we would do something like load users CB and pass in a callback that takes in an error and a data. And we can say if error console log error return. And then for data, we just do a console log data. So pretty straightforward callback scenario. Of course, I am missing my my arrow right there on line 15. So yeah, we invoke a function. We invoke an asynchronous function. And then we say, hey, once you're done with that, invoke my custom function, passing in a potential error along with potentially the data you received. So very, very boring vanilla JavaScript-y stuff. If we load this up, we will see that we do indeed get success and we get all our tracks loaded. But we can do better than this. There's a lot of problems with this sort of pattern. One of the biggest problems with this pattern is that it's not, you can't combine this with other asynchronous operations. Let's say that we wanted to have two asynchronous operations going at once, but then have a single callback when both of them are done. Now, I'm sure you can imagine implementing that in some sort of way here in the code. But it would be complex and kind of annoying to write, and you would have to rewrite it every time you had two async operations going on at once, but you only wanted to deal with one callback. Another issue is that adding things like a timeout. So for example, if it took longer than a second for this to finish, I want to throw an error to the user. That would be also slightly difficult with this sort of thing. Basically, we're just seeing rudimentary JavaScript here. The whole idea of promises is taking this sort of pattern and codifying it into a powerful library that is composable and gives us a lot of more features. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's rewrite this CB method using promises. So we're just going to say load users, but first thing to note, we are not accepting a callback. Instead, what we're going to do is we are going to return a promise object. Say return new promise. Now, before I fill in his parameters, we see that we are creating new promise. This class comes from either the browser itself or from the polyfill. Now, what does promise take? What's the parameter that it wants? Well, it wants a function, and that function's going to accept two parameters. So the function's going to look like this. Basically, what we have going on here is we are returning an instantiation of a class that accepts a function as a parameter, and the function accepts as a parameter accepts two other functions as a parameter. So done is a function, fail is a function. When I invoke done, that tells the promise API that this promise has successfully retrieved whatever data that it wants to, or successfully performed whatever operation it was requested to. If we invoke fail, that means, well, something failed. There was an error, there was a problem. So how do we do this? Well, let's go ahead and just redo our AJAX example. So I'm going to say jQuery.ajax / users.json. And then I'm going to pass in data type is JSON. And then for my success callback, I'm simply going to invoke done with data. For my error callback, I'm simply going to invoke fail with data. So what goes on here, or sorry, fail with error, derp. Okay, so what goes on here is we tell jQuery, okay, go out, grab this data, go download this JSON file. If you succeeded, we will invoke this done function. If you failed, we will invoke this fail function. All right, so that's well and good, but how do we go about actually using it? It's really straightforward. we first invoke the method load users, and that, remember, that returns a promise. So then I can invoke another method on this, and there are two methods that I can choose from, then and catch. We'll focus on then for now. If I invoke then, I pass in more callbacks. So the first callback I pass in is the success callback. So I'm going to say data goes into console log, we got data, console log, data. And then as the second callback, it's going to be the error callback or the fail callback. So the error callback is simply going to say console log, we got an error, and it's going to say console log error. Okay, so I'm actually I'm making this code a little bit longer with my formatting than it needs to, just to really try to show what's going on with this promise. So basically, when we retrieve a promise, we can invoke the then function on it, and we can pass in two callbacks. One callback for success, one callback for error. And that's it. So now if I came back here and hit refresh, we'll see that okay, well, this is a fine example. I misspelled users. I didn't add the S to it. And we got an error. Notice how it says we got an error. The error callback was invoked because the fail callback within the promise constructor was invoked. Let's go ahead and fix that real fast. If I refresh now, we get nothing because Babel decided to stop babbling. But now when I refresh, we got data. And in this case, it's just printing out data because for some reason I put that in as a string literal, which is obviously not what I intended to do. Okay, we got the data back. Really, I mean, that's mostly about it as far as promises go. So I'm just going to show a couple more common use cases and things that you need to know that make promises more powerful. But this is the straight up simple version of using a promise. So let's go ahead and I'm going to create two helper functions for the rest of our examples. I'm going to say function succeed at milliseconds, which is going to return a new promise. And I forgot the arrow again. I tend to do that for some reason. It's going to return a new promise, and it's going to say window.setTimeout, and it's going to invoke done after milliseconds. So this succeed at is going to wait X amount of milliseconds and then complete the promise. I'm also going to do a fail at milliseconds, which is pretty much the exact same thing, except for we're going to invoke the fail at milliseconds. So now I have two helpers to kind of delay things, so we can kind of take a look at the process of working with promises and combining them to do interesting things. So let's say that I wanted to go ahead and let's say I wanted to wait a second and then load my users. All right. So what I could do here is I can say succeed at a second. Then what I want to do is I want to say load users. Then once the users are loaded, I want to console log out the data. Now, a couple interesting things to note. On both of these then invocations, I'm not passing in an error handler. Neither parameter is actually required. You can either pass in a success handler or no error handler, or you can pass in null for the success handler and then an error handler. But let's see how this behaves. If I come in here and refresh, notice how we wait a whole second and then we get the second thing. I don't know if you guys saw that. So we wait a second and then we get the JSON file. Now, this actually is a suboptimal way to combine promises. There's actually a significantly cleaner syntax that we can take advantage of. So let's rewrite this example using a better syntax. I'm going to say after a second, then load users, then data console log data. So if you invoke then, and you return another promise, that promise then gets chained. All right? So let's say 2 seconds, just to make it obvious that this is the one that's going to work. So I'm returning, remember, when you have a arrow function like this, where you only have one statement, it's equivalent to if I had said return load users, if I had used curly braces. So we're returning a promise, and we're adding a promise to the chain. If I come back here and hit refresh, we get our guy in a second, and then we get our second guy in 2 seconds. All right, so you can keep this chain going as long as you want to, and it'll just work. That's where promises start to really shine. But let's go look at another example. I'm going to go load in my tracks. So I'm going to take this load users function. I'm just going to cheat. I'm going to copy and paste it. So we'll have load users. We'll rename it load tracks, and then we'll AJAX on tracks.json, or we'll invoke AJAX on tracks.json. Now let's say I wanted to load users and load tracks at the same time. Well, it's really easy. Simply do Promise.all, pass an array of promises. So in this case, load users, and then load tracks. Then this Promise.all returns a new promise that's a combination of both of these promises, and it'll only finish once both are done. So then I can say then data. And then I can say const users, comma tracks equals data. I can say console log users, console log tracks. So you'll notice that what gets returned back in this data is an array of what got returned back from both of these callbacks promises if they were successful. So we can come over here and hit F5, and we got a promise rejection because tracks.json does not exist. Tracks.json does not exist because I called it tracks.js because I can't spell extensions. Okay, so we fixed that, but we did get to see an example of the promise was rejected, so we did not get our Promise.all invoked. But now if I come here, notice how we get our tracks somewhere. There we go. We got our tracks here. Should probably add some console logs in here to delineate all these different things, but whatever. You guys get the idea. Promise.all will invoke all the promises, and once they're all done, we'll then invoke the then. If one of them fails, it'll invoke the error. Let's talk about doing timeouts. There's another promise function called race. So I can say Promise.race and pass in an array. Now, the first promise to complete will be returned regardless if the other promises failed. So let's say I did succeed at 1 second, and then I do a fail at 500 milliseconds, and then I do then. And for here, I'm simply going to do console log fail, console log succeed. So what's going on here with race is that if succeed finishes first, we will get a success, and the data... Whoops, I totally got that backwards. If succeed returns first, we will get that data returned back to our success callback. If fail returns first, we will get a failure. If succeed returns, but then fail happens later, we'll still get a success. So we can test this out. By hitting refresh, we see that we failed. But let's say I change this fail at to 2 seconds so that it completes after our succeed at. Now we get success. So that's a way to implement timeouts. So for example, if I wanted to implement a timeout for how long it took to get my track data, I could say load tracks and then fail at 1 second, or let's say 3 seconds. So if I loaded the tracks and it takes longer than 3 seconds, this entire promise that's returned, remember, this is a promise that gets returned by .race. It's a new promise that's a combination of the previous two. Then it'll fail. The last method, there's a couple more methods, but they're not as important. The last method I want to talk about is catch. So if I did fail at and 1 second, but I only wanted to handle this promise if it failed, I could do .catch. The catch method is just like then, except for it doesn't accept a success callback. It only accepts an error callback. And as you can see, if I come over here and refresh, in 2 seconds we get the catch. All right, so that was a quick introduction to promises. You really start to see their power when you start combining them in larger applications. But yeah, I think they're really cool, and I'm really glad to see them implemented in JavaScript, or rather ECMAScript 2015, because I make use of them quite frequently. It's also important to note that the Promise API is very duck-typed, meaning other Promise APIs will work with these Promise APIs as long as they behave in the same way as this Promise API. So it doesn't necessarily, when you do a Promise.all, you don't necessarily need to pass in promises you got from a new Promise instantiation. You might also be able to pass in promises you got from an external library as well. But that wraps up this video, and we'll see you guys in the next one.